Our next guest is Congresswoman Barbara Lee of California. She has spent decades in public service advocating for legislative action to end poverty across the nation. She's the only Black woman on the House Democratic leadership team this session of Congress, serving as co-chair of the Powerful Policy and Steering Committee. She also sits on the House Budget and House Appropriations Committee. Congresswoman Lee, thanks so much for joining us today.
Happy to be with you. Thank you.
So yesterday, the Congressional Black Caucus rolled out its 100-day plan. And part of that plan includes a new domestic policy leadership team, which you and Senator Cory Booker are co-chairing. So what is, when it comes to that leadership team, what is your goal in advancing legislation this session of Congress that really benefits Black Americans?
Sure. Thank you very much for having me with you. And I think part of what we're excited about is that finally we have an administration who has as one of its buckets in terms of policy orientation, the issue of racial justice and racial equity. And so Senator Booker, myself, our great chair, Joyce Beatty, we put together this team to really work with Susan Rice, who chairs the Domestic Council, to look at all of the issues. This is a whole of government approach as it relates to systemic racism, structural racism, and how we really begin to dismantle those aspects of our federal policies. This is on all fronts, and then move forward with racial equity and racial justice is central to everything that we do.
And part of, I'm sure the bills that are high on your list include the George Floyd Injustice and Policing Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, both bills that passed the House last session but weren't able to even make it to the floor of the Senate for a vote. How crucial is it for those bills to get through, or at least to a vote on the Senate floor this session?
Extremely important. And I just want to take a moment to salute Congresswoman Karen Bass, who is the lead sponsor of the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. This bill, we got it through the House last year, and we're going to work, and hopefully soon it will be scheduled to once again be actually voted on in the House sooner rather than later. And so I'm confident that because of the brutal the brutal murders of Mr. Floyd and Breonna Taylor and the rest of the country actually witnessing what we've always known and experienced throughout our history here in America is that police misconduct and police reform is absolutely necessary if there will truly be a just criminal justice system. And so we and Congresswoman Bass and the Congressional Black Caucus has built support across caucus lines, and we should be moving that bill forward very shortly. Also on the Voting Rights Act, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, that's imperative. We see now states that are engaging in putting forth more voter suppression efforts to further erode our voting rights. And so this bill will be coming. We're not sure exactly when it will be scheduled, but this is extremely fundamental to our democracy. And again, the Congressional Black Caucus is leading. And we certainly know that the environment that we find ourselves in requires us to be very, aggressive in pushing forth this bill, because these states are moving very quickly as a result of the expansion of the voting of people who vote now, younger people, people of color, our seniors, the coalitions that are being put together. That's a threat to others, to mainly Republicans. And so now these states are coming down hard on voter suppression efforts. So we have to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act very soon.
And when it comes to the question of social justice and racial justice, we actually have an audience question for you.
Sure.
My question for the panelists is why people talk about social justice and not economic justice?
Why do people talk about social justice and not economic justice? Right. We need to talk about, and I'm always saying we've got to talk about social, economic, and racial justice. I mean, racial justice, economic justice, social justice intersect, especially if you're an African American. And so some people, maybe not have that complete perspective in terms of economic justice and how social justice, economic justice, how they intersect with racial justice. Because again, as an African American, we know how important racial justice is, how important economic justice is, and how important social justice is. So we have to talk about the three together.
And to that point, one of the big things when it comes to racial justice is the COVID-19 response from the federal government. And President Biden has rolled out this national strategy. But what are you hearing from your constituents, from your communities of color, about how resources and vaccine distribution have been going there?
Sure, and that's one thing that we've witnessed throughout the country, another manifestation of systemic racism in our healthcare system because of the disproportionate rates of transmission and deaths in the African American community and other communities of color. And so it's the same thing in California. Disproportionate vaccine distribution. We're trying to get that right. Finally, we have FEMA established a vaccination distribution and vaccination site at the Oakland Coliseum, which is the location where African American and Latinx communities can access, and low-income communities. And this partnership seems to be working well in my district, even though we've had some bumps in the road. But overall, myself and the Congressional Black Caucus, Hispanic Caucus, Asian Pacific American Caucus, and our two Native American women, we put forth the COVID Community Care Act, which really lays out the roadmap for how we address testing, contact tracing, and vaccine distribution in medically underserved and communities of color. I do have to say that we were able in this last survival package to get in $2.8 billion for targeted communities, which was a very important first step. And we were able to put in $300 million. And again, that's as a result of us working together with Speaker Pelosi's leadership and our committee chairs to be able to get in $300 million for vaccine distribution, specifically targeted to underserved communities. In this next bill, in the $1.9 trillion package, we also have additional strategies and funding. We have to hire people from our communities because so much of what we're hearing in my community and throughout the country is that historically we have an understanding of how systemic racism has worked to our detriment in terms of the Tuskegee experiment, in terms of being used as guinea pigs for surgeries and for medications that really killed us in many respects. And so we're reticent and we're reluctant. And so with the vaccine, we have to have, because we know this is a matter of life and death, we have to have trusted messengers who can be hired from our community, trained to deliver these public health messages. So we put resources in just for that purpose, because we know this is truly a matter of life and death.
Well, Congresswoman, thanks so much for taking the time to come on here and talk about all the things that we're doing and all the things that still need to happen. So we appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. Glad to be with you.
Hey, Congresswoman, Steve Clemons from the Hill. Also, I told Marty that I'll be his Ed McMahon to, his Johnny Carson, and he is just of a different generation and didn't get that. So I'm the sidekick here. But I wanted to, ask you one other thing. Every administration has a blind spot, and I, respect and just know your work for so long on this. And there have been Democratic administrations as well as Republican administrations that have not solved, the overall problem of systemic racism in this country. And I guess my question is the Biden administration, from your perspective, doing all that's needed right now? Are there blind spots? What do you think is the next horizon of things to push even this administration further than it's gone so far?
Sure, Steve. And I don't think they're blind spots. I think that by them coming out very quickly with regard to their priorities in terms of racial equity and racial justice tells me that that's a priority for them. We have to continue to push to have transformative change in our policies in our federal government. And a couple of things that, of course, myself, Congresswoman Jackson Lee are really pushing for, as well as others, is the establishment of the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Commission, which 40 other countries have always done after genocides, crimes against humanity, and slavery. We've never had that, so that the public can understand the connection between 401 years ago and the Middle Passage and the enslavement of Africans and systemic racism, and why they see and Mr. George Floyd being killed brutally by the police, or why they witnessed the disparities in COVID as it relates to the transmission and deaths of relating to the virus, or why there's this huge wealth gap, or why the disproportionate rates of African Americans are incarcerated to our population. You know, the whys, the systemic racism, and a lot of people are just becoming aware of white supremacy and systemic racism, but they don't understand that we've made a lot of progress since 401 years ago, but we still have to crack these chains of slavery and move forward. And so we have to have that moment where we educate the public about the roots of systemic racism, because you hear so many people now talking about healing and moving forward.
Yeah.
Well, you can't heal until we address the truth. So we have to have this moment of a commission to establish that and move forward to develop, study and develop reparations. And so we're working with the Biden administration to explain and put this in as part of their strategies as it relates to racial equity and racial justice, because we have to have something that's sustainable and truly transformative in terms of the reorganizing of how we address racial justice.
Marty and I just got told we got an extra couple of minutes, so it'd be great. So we're going to steal them from you. But I'm going to just ask you another question and then go to Marty real quick. You know, I think you and I talked about this a long time ago, and there's this need. The reason we're doing this show is not to talk, preach to the choir, right? We're not trying to preach to the choir today. We're trying to sort of talk broadly about experience, empathy, why systemic racism is so stubbornly resilient. I know your constituency, and I know that you talk to folks that are not necessarily in this. What have been the best practices that you've deployed in your conversations with people who do not understand this experience? I'd love to kind of hear, Barbara Lee's, toolkit, if you will, on how you bring people over who have not been part of this conversation into it, so they now feel part of the, action plan, if you will.
Sure, thank you for that. And I have a very enlightened constituency. And my constituency, though, still, after the horrific murder of Mr. Floyd, called me, many people, many white progressives, actually. So what are we seeing here? After the visuals of Black people dying disproportionately from COVID-19, they call me and say, what are we seeing here? What is this about? And I have to explain to them that this is about a system of government that enslaved Africans that has made, we've had progress in terms of our desegregation efforts. Mm-hmm. But remember, we had black codes, we had segregation, we had Jim Crow, we had lynchings. The last lynching was only, 1960. We've had a series of structural racism built into America, and that's part of its DNA since 401 years ago. So I have to explain the trajectory and how and why systemic racism and structural racism and white supremacy is alive and well, and why we have to do things differently. And I think January 6th just highlighted it. Several people called me and said, my God, what's happening? I said, look, Black people have known what domestic terrorism for all of our lives here. We know what white supremacy is, and then I have to break it down and explain. Mm-hmm. So that's why this commission is so important, so we can explain these issues, so we can talk about the historical context, because otherwise people just keep spinning their wheels and don't really understand why in a country that's supposed to be a country of liberty and justice for all, that we still have these issues. Finally, I'll say I listened to Mark Morial and his story about going to Sears. Well, I share my stories. My mother, I almost didn't get into this world because they wouldn't admit my mother, because she was Black, into the hospital and she needed a C-section. After a long story, but finally they admitted her, but they left her with no care and she almost died. And so they had to rush her in to the emergency room, and it was too late for a C-section, and they had to deliver me using forceps. My mother I almost didn't breathe coming out. Wow. And my mother almost died during childbirth. Wow. And so these are stories that every Black person has. And so I try to share these stories about my personal life so they can kind of understand why we have to do something different in this country.
Well, I'm really, really glad you're telling those stories. It's important. I know sometimes it's very hard to do that. So on behalf of Marty and myself, Congresswoman Barbara Lee, thank you. Please come back. And it's really important to do what you're doing. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Sure, anytime. Thank you all for doing this.